Okay, so the topic for our lecture today is the United States in the 1920s. I'm going to take kind of a broad overview of life in America in the 20s, looking at what problems were we facing, okay, and it fell. Way to go, Reed.
Do you want me to film it?
Look, there's Calder. Hi. All right, we're just going to get the back of Reed's head in it.
All right, sounds good.
All right, there we go. So we're going to look at some of the problems facing the United States in the 1920s, and we'll look at how the U.S. starts to come out of those problems, right? Why is my clicker not working? Because it's not plugged in, that's why. So in particular, kind of the main question we're going to look at here is, what problems did we experience at the end of World War I, and how do we start to come out of that? And it's still not working. I know it's not the battery. All right, well that's annoying. All right, so the first area we're going to talk about is economic problems, okay? We were doing pretty well during the war, but the U.S. starts to face some pretty serious economic problems after the war. Okay? We've got a much weakened economy after the war because the factories that have been making all the stuff for the war suddenly are out of work. Right? So we've got this weakened economy. We've been making all this stuff for the war. Now all of a sudden, these factories are shutting down. Wartime jobs had ended right when 4 million soldiers come home looking for work. A lot of businesses and factories closed. In the first couple of years after the war. $5 million people were unemployed. And inflation was making everything worse.
Because they're still paying off the taxes for the war, right? Is that why they didn't play?
Inflation means prices are going up.
Right.
Right? So you've got 5 million people unemployed, not earning an income, at the same time that prices are starting to rise. Right? So people are really feeling the pinch in the first year or two after the war. The economy is struggling. 1918, 1919, into 1920. Americans are hurting. So we've got economic problems that we're facing post-World War I. With me?
Yeah.
Okay, makes sense? And we've got some political problems, and we're going to talk about 3 different groups here that are identified in your outline. The first are these radical groups. Okay, radical groups. So when we talk about radicals, we're talking about people who have extreme beliefs. Radicals are people who have extreme beliefs who want to change government and society. And I'm sure you've heard the word radical before, right? But in this instance, we're talking about radical means, right, extreme. People who have, extreme ideas about government and society, and they want to act on it. They want to change government and society. In the late 19-teens, right, 1918, 1919, radical groups were gaining in popularity and being more active. They're starting to grow. People had seen the success of the Russian Revolution, and they wanted to spread it to other places. Think back to what we talked about with we didn't go into it in great detail, but communists were kind of considered radical, right? And communists had successfully overthrown the Russian government. People said, hey, radical groups in America, like communists and socialists, said they were successful there. We could be successful here in changing the government like that. So they start to grow in popularity. They start to become much more active. Radical groups staged strikes in a lot of places. What is a strike?
It's like protesting or like refusing to do certain things. For example, like if you're like being underpaid or something like that, like you just don't go to work and you...
Yeah, so a strike is a specific protest, right? When workers walk off the job. So these radical groups had staged strikes in a bunch of places throughout America, right? They're rallying up these workers to walk out on the job, to refuse to work, right? They also committed a couple of high-profile bombings in the U.S., including outside of Wall Street. They set off radical groups, right? These would be like the really radical ones, right? A lot of times like anarchists, people who wanted to kind of get rid of the government.
Wait, what street?
Wall Street, which we said yesterday, Wall Street is the center of the economy, right? It's kind of the heart of the American economy. So these radical groups committed a bombing on Wall Street, killed a bunch of people. They also committed a bombing outside of the Attorney General's house.
Like they just... a bombing?
They set off a bomb outside of the Attorney General's house. I don't remember if that one harmed anyone or not. The one on Wall Street did. People were killed and injured. It was right outside the stock exchange. The bombing outside of the Attorney General's house, I don't remember. I have to look it up to see if it actually killed anybody or not. The Attorney General is the nation's top law enforcement officer. So they're trying to send a very clear signal, right? That they are against the actions of the U.S. government. And so you've got these radical groups that are causing fear inside of the United States. People are worried, right, about these radical groups. They're worried about communists. They're worried about anarchists sort of attacking the American way of life. All right, a second political problem was immigration. Immigration had basically stopped during the war. And now that the war was over, immigration picked back up rapidly. There was a huge increase in immigration to America. And so you see the political cartoon we have here, you know, a lot of it's coming from Europe. Why would, in 1918, 1919, lots of people be wanting to get out of Europe and come to America?
Because they're like getting out of the war and most of their like houses and stuff have been destroyed.
Yeah, like there's a lot of places in Europe that aren't in great shape after the war, because that's where the fighting was. So there's a huge, it had come to basically a stop. The war's over now, people are like, get me out of here. There's a huge growth in immigration to America. And this presented a problem because many Americans associated immigrants with these radical groups. They associated immigrants with radical groups.
Is that kind of like how whenever we see, like the headdress that a lot of people wear for their religion in India, people automatically think of terrorism?
Sure, right? That there's that, you know, Americans might make that association, right? And that's a little bit of what's happening, right? And most of the time, very unfairly, right? But Americans said, hey, we got these people coming in from Europe. They're bringing these radical ideas with them, like communism and socialism. We're not okay with it. Another problem with immigration was that a lot of Americans associated immigration with the lack of jobs. They blamed immigrants for taking away jobs from Americans. Okay, and you know, that pops up a bunch of times in American history. If we've got 5 million Americans who are unemployed, they're not going to be happy to see tons of immigrants coming over and competing for jobs. And so as a result, the government takes action to start to put some real limits on immigration. And that's, you know, again, you see Stuart with the political cartoon, right? Uncle Sam here saying, no, we're gonna funnel these immigrants through. We're not gonna let them all through. We're gonna let some of them through. So there's kind of a crackdown on immigration after the war.
So that's saying like only 3% of
Yeah, and I'm not sure where that specific number comes from, but you know, you get the idea that we're not letting everybody in. There's kind of a crackdown. And a lot of it had to do with that fear that we're letting in radicals, we're letting in people who compete for jobs. All right, a third major political problem came from this idea of crime and strikes. Right? And this is an effect of the economic problems that we just talked about first. Okay? Because we have these economic problems, this leads to an increase in crime. Right? Crime goes up in America in the post-war period. Employers start to cut wages and increase hours. I should probably be typing at this point.
Weren't the wages and hours already like at 60?
Well, they're not great, right? But you can imagine, right, that as employers start to cut wages and increase hours, more and more and more strikes happen, and those strikes start to get increasingly violent. So this leads to challenges to our rights. Americans are sitting back and they're seeing a rise in radical groups, they're seeing a rise in violence, they're seeing a rise in the number of labor strikes. And they're like, all right, we need to do something about this. And so the government's going to crack down in ways that present challenges to our rights as Americans. And a big part of that is this Red Scare idea. Okay? This Red Scare idea. So basically, because of the rise of radical groups and the rise of and the fear of communism spreading to America, the government starts to crack down on radicals. And this crackdown is called the Palmer Raids. Palmer, coincidentally, was the Attorney General. Why might the Attorney General lead a crackdown on radical groups? They tried to blow up his house, right? And again, that doesn't mean every radical group. You know, the bombings are carried out by the absolute extreme radical groups, but they all sort of get painted with the same brush, right? Radicals are radicals, and we need to crack down on them. And so the government cracks down in the Palmer Raids. In these raids, people who were suspected of being a radical could be arrested, held without trial, and some were even deported. What does it mean to be deported?
Sent back to your own.
Yeah, you're sent out of America. So we've got these government crackdowns, and people who were suspected of being radicals, they could be arrested, they could be held without trial, they could even be deported. And this raised some real concerns about civil liberties because some of these actions went against our Constitution.
So is this like kind of like where like with McCarthyism and?
That's gonna come in the second Red Scare.
Okay.
This is the first Red Scare. The second Red Scare is gonna come kind of similarly after World War II.
Right.
Fears of communism.
Yeah.
Right? So this is communism just kind of getting onto the world stage because of the Russian Revolution. So this is what historians call the first Red Scare.
Right.
Okay? The second Red Scare will include things like McCarthyism.
Can I go to the bathroom?
Right? Well, you're going to miss quite a bit, probably. So if there's any way for you to not... Wait, I already put communism. What was there? Oh, Constitution. This raised some real concerns, right? Because some of what the government was doing goes against what's in the Constitution. It violated civil liberties. Right? The Constitution says, hang on a minute, you can't do that.
They seem to keep violating the Constitution. First with the draft.
Draft doesn't violate the Constitution.
There's a
Well, I mean,
Drafts are allowed. Okay. We did talk about sort of the crackdown on free speech during the war. Yeah. So that relates to this idea. Right? And so we're going to read, as we get into the textbook tomorrow, we're going to read about this Sacco and Vanzetti case that raises some real concerns about civil liberties, that raises some concerns about radical groups, and anti-immigrant feeling. Okay. All right, so our next area of problems, we've talked about economic problems, we've talked about political problems. Our third big area are social problems that we were facing. Okay? One of these problems is nativism. Okay? Because of the economic and social problems.
Did you skip one? It says challenge to our rights. Or did we already go over that?
Did we go over challenges to our rights?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, I kept on typing it. Never mind.
Yeah, that's why I have you guys review, right? And look over your notes. So you can go, oh, wait a minute, that's supposed to go there. So as long as you got it, all you have to do is cut and paste it in the right spot. All right, so social problems, the problem we're talking about first is nativism. So because of the economic and political problems, there was a rise in anti-immigrant feeling.
It was
Anti-immigrant feeling in America. Right? That idea of nativism is right, the idea that, hey, we should look after Americans first, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, there's a growth in anti-immigrant feeling. And so the government passes laws to restrict immigration severely. It pretty much limited immigration to people from Western Europe. Countries like England and France.
countries like Germany had a hard time getting in.
Eastern European countries had a hard time because Eastern European countries were seen as this is where the radicals are coming from, right? So countries like France and England are closer to us. They're more similar to the United States. So it's like, all right, we'll let them in because we don't see them as radical. It's those countries in Eastern Europe, even some, other parts of the world, anti-Chinese feelings. The United States cuts back and says, we're going to limit immigration. We're going to restrict immigration, particularly excluding people who don't look like us, who don't share the same sort of religious values as most of Americans. And that's that idea of nativism, right? Of course, we have the rise of the KKK in the late 19-teens, early 1920s. So the KKK stands for Ku Klux Klan, all with K's, hence the KKK. And the Ku Klux Klan comes roaring back. And it's fueled by this anti-Jewish, anti-immigrant feeling in America. Anti-Catholic. And of course, anti-African American, right? The KKK has always had that anti-African American piece. But it comes back strong because it gets new fuel. It's not just anti-African American, it's anti-Jewish. It's anti-Catholic, it's anti-immigrant.
Yeah.
Anti-everything? Anti-everything except white, pure Americans, right? If you're, a white Christian American, then you weren't really on the radar screen. But if you were other, right? You had different religious backgrounds, you had different cultural backgrounds, you were an immigrant, you were African American. Yeah, so the KKK comes roaring back. diversifying its portfolio, so to speak. Right? It's not just anti-African American, it's anti a bunch of other groups as well.
Let's just not kill black people. Let's kill everybody.
Well, and so speaking of African Americans, right? African Americans are still facing a lot of discrimination, right? In particular, black veterans, right? Black soldiers who were coming back had even more difficulty finding jobs than white soldiers. African Americans continued to face lynchings. In the South, but not just the South, right? It wasn't just limited, mostly in the South, but not just the South.
So the reason they came to the North, they're getting it back again, basically.
Well, a lot of them in that Great Migration escaped the South to get away from that, right? But lynchings didn't only happen in the South; they happened in other places as well.
What I meant was like the horror of the KKK.
Well, yeah, the KKK was a nationwide thing. In 1919, there were several very violent race riots in America. One of the worst ones in these race riots was in Chicago, where, I kid you not, it started because a black teenager at a segregated beach had drifted in the water into the white section. Right? And white beachgoers start throwing rocks and fighting breaks out, and before you know it, there's a race riot in Chicago that left 38 people dead. Hundreds were injured, right? So Chicago's in the north. So African Americans are still facing violence and discrimination.
How many people, sorry? 37?
38 were killed, hundreds of people were injured, and that's just one example. That was one of the worst, but there were race riots in other cities in America too. Okay, so we've laid out economic problems, political problems, social problems. Now we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit to the second part. We're talking about, okay, politics and business in the 1920s. Say, okay, how did we start to address some of that so that in particular the economy starts to boom in the ways that we talked about in the video we watched yesterday? And so we've got a change in national leadership, right? We go from a period where Democrats had control of the government to a period where Republicans have control of the government. Okay? So starting and this is already, I think, in your outline, right? It says in 1920, Warren G. Harding was elected president. This is Warren G. Harding. This begins a period when the Republican Party dominated the government, and these Republican presidents, so I've kind of lumped them together because they all had similar policies. Some of the things that the Republican leaders were doing in the 1920s was supporting a free market system. They were very supportive of a free market system.
What does that exactly mean?
I'll explain that. That's the second sentence here. I'll explain that in just a second. They supported a free market system, which means they wanted to put as few restrictions on business as possible. They wanted to keep the government out of business. It's a free market, right? It's the idea that there's as few restrictions on businesses as possible. Let them grow and do their thing and keep the government out of it. All three of these presidents also focused on cutting taxes and spending and debt. And all three of these presidents promoted big business over workers. They took the side of big business over the side of workers. And so, if the government is basically taking the shackles off of businesses and letting them do what they want and saying, grow and make money, that tends to be pretty good for the economy. So what we have, last couple of topics here, is this boom in business, right? There's an end to the recession. So under these Republican presidents, this little recession after World War I comes to an end. Businesses started to expand, and this created more jobs. Wages nearly doubled in the 1920s. Right? How much people were getting paid, right? Almost doubled in the 1920s. Whole new industries were created, like the automobile industry, the aviation industry. And because of the assembly line, we started to make products faster and for less money. So the last part of the lecture outline points out that, okay, yeah, that sounds good, right? Jobs are being created, people are being paid more, products cost less, so you're able to buy more, but we do need to note that not everybody prospered in the 1920s. Three groups in particular I want to point out, and then we're done. One is farmers. Farmers were really struggling with wartime debt. And conditions for farm workers were really pretty bad. Right? Farmers were in a lot of debt. Conditions, working conditions were often really bad. Another group was laborers, in particular unskilled laborers, right? unskilled laborers, and they struggled to keep jobs. So the picture I have here as an example is coal miners. As the country starts to switch to electricity, coal miners find it harder and harder to get a job, to keep a job. So different groups of laborers, particularly unskilled laborers, really struggled. And then, we mentioned already, African Americans. African American workers really missed out on this prosperity. They were often the last to be hired for jobs and the first to be fired. Black workers were paid less than white workers. And they were usually barred from joining labor unions.
Barred means like refused.
They were prohibited, prevented from joining labor unions.